Hey there. Tonight, we drift far from the familiar fires of the medieval peasant's hearth and onto the icy seas of the north. But this isn't the Viking tale you think you know. There are no triumphant war cries or epic horned helmets. This is about what it really took to raid across foreign shores, survive the cold, the hunger, the blood, and the doubt. It's a quieter story, harsher, colder, and far more human. So dim the lights, wrap yourself in something warm, and let's set sail. Not with heroes, but with the kind of men who had no choice but to become wolves on water. The sea groaned under them, a low, yawning sound that made the timbers shiver and the men stare out at the horizon like it might swallow them whole. Leif hadn't slept in 2 days. None of them had, really. You couldn't sleep on a ship like this. Low, narrow, wet to the knees. There were no hammocks, no sails to shield them from the spray. Just cold air, splinters in your thighs, and the rhythmic slap of paddles in the water, again and again and again until your arms felt like wax melting from your shoulders. They were 3 days from home and already starving. The salted fish had gone bad, worms in the brine. The barley was damp, and the goatskin flasks of mead had been drained too soon. Raiders need hunger, the Jarl had said, but hunger made your hands tremble. And that's not what you want when you're meant to swing an axe. Leif looked down at his palms, blistered, split open, fingers swollen. The cold didn't numb them anymore, it just made them harder to move. The man beside him, a giant named Stig, had stopped rowing an hour ago. He didn't say why, didn't need to. His fingers were black at the tips. The sea was punishing, even before they reached enemy shores, and when they did reach them, well, that was its own kind of horror. England. Land of churches, fat sheep, and armed villagers. They didn't tell you that part in the sagas. The first hut they found was empty. The second held a woman and 3 children, huddled behind a stone oven. The raiders tied her up, ignored the children, and took what little food there was, a sack of flour and half a wheel of cheese. Stig tried to smile as he ate it raw, still standing in the ashes of the hearth. Leif didn't eat. He stood outside in the rain, watching the coastline. He felt no victory, no thrill, only his stomach folding in on itself and the distant cry of someone discovering what had just happened. The third hut had a man in it. He fought with a pitchfork. It didn't matter. Stig put an axe in his chest and moved on. But Leif stood there longer. He stared at the blood pooling on the dirt floor, the pitchfork still trembling in the man's dead grip. This wasn't a battle. It wasn't war. It was something else, something colder, harder to name. They set fire to the village on the Jarl's order. Not out of malice, just protocol. You raided, you burned, you left no trail. The smoke rose fast, thick, black, choking the air as they ran back toward the ship, food and silver in their arms. Stig limping now, his black fingers crumbling as he held the loot. They didn't speak on the return. There was no song, no laughter, only the sound of rowing again and again and again. And when they reached the fjord, when their wives and sons and daughters ran to greet them, they didn't smile. Not because they were ashamed, but because they knew the cost. Because they knew they would do it again, not for glory, but because winter was coming, and starving in your own home was worse than dying on foreign soil. They arrived at dusk. The longboat slipped into the fjord like a shadow, quiet, battered, low in the water from what little it carried. Not silver, not treasure, just sacks of barley, 2 stolen goats, and a few rusted weapons from the bodies they'd left behind. Hardly the bounty of legend. Leif stepped off last, boots sinking into the cold black sand. His legs trembled as they adjusted to land again. He hadn't walked properly in over a week. From the head of the village, torchlight bobbed through the trees. Women, children, the old. They waited at the shoreline with wide eyes, some hopeful, others already braced for disappointment. No cheering, no horns, no feast fires, just a cold silence as the raiders dragged themselves forward. Stig collapsed before he reached the path. His fingers had turned black all the way to the knuckles now. The village healer came to look, but there was nothing she could do. Saltwater and cold had taken their toll. They built a pyre that night. Not for Stig. He still lived. But for the others who hadn't made it back. 7 men gone. No graves. Only names whispered into smoke as flames crackled through driftwood and pine. Leif stood at the edge of the circle, watching firelight flicker in the eyes of the villagers. None of them cried. That's the thing about being a Viking. They didn't mourn the same way. But they remembered, in quiet ways, in the absence at the table, in the clothes never worn again, in the children who slept closer to the hearth at night. Leif's wife, Astrid, met him outside their home. She didn't speak. She just looked at him, head tilted, taking in the dried blood on his tunic, the black bruises on his arms, the long, slow way he walked now. He wanted to say something, to lie maybe, to soften the truth, but his mouth wouldn't move. She stepped aside to let him in. The inside of their home hadn't changed. Same carved beams, same wolf pelt bed, same three-legged stool that wobbled when you sat on it, but something felt off. The hearth was cold, the stew pot was empty, the child's shoes were missing from the doorway. "Your son," he said. Astrid stared at the fireless hearth. "He's gone." Leif blinked. "Where?" "Fever took him. 4 nights ago. No ceremony. No warning. Just the fact, laid bare like everything else in this world." He sat down slowly on the stool. It still wobbled. "You missed the burial," she added. He nodded, as if that mattered. As if time still worked the same for men who sailed and burned and killed just to bring back food that would be gone in a week. Outside, the wind picked up. Not the sea wind, the mountain wind. It howled down the slope like a wounded animal, slipping between cracks in the doorframe, carrying with it the bite of another winter on the way. Astrid finally moved. She knelt by the fire pit and struck flint against steel. Sparks flew, caught, died. She tried again and again. Finally, a flame. She didn't ask about the raid, she didn't want to know, and Leif didn't want to remember. Outside, the Jarl called a meeting. They gathered in the longhouse, torches flickering against the beams, faces gaunt and drawn. Not warriors, survivors, and barely that. The Jarl was already speaking when Leif arrived. "Next time we'll strike farther south," he said. "Richer lands, softer folk, more gold." No one cheered. A man named Rold leaned forward. "What did gold do for us this time?" The Jarl's eyes narrowed. "We lived. You want to starve this winter? Stig won't live." "That's not my fault." Silence. Then Rold stood, slowly, like he was lifting the weight of the sea with him. "My son's dead," he said. Another man echoed, "So is mine." The Jarl didn't respond. He simply turned toward the fire and poured himself a horn of mead. "Then you'll raid harder next season." Leif stepped outside. The night had gone still again. The sea looked calm, gentle, but he knew better. Out there, beyond the fjord, the world waited. And it wasn't glory that waited with it. It was hunger, cold, blood, and the quiet, crushing knowledge that for men like them, there was no such thing as coming home. By the time winter truly set in, the village was carved into silence. Snow blanketed the rooftops like burial shrouds. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, trembling ribbons. The sea, once a roiling path to riches and ruin, now lay frozen in patches near the shore, its edge jagged, black beneath the ice. Leif chopped wood alone outside his home. Each swing of the axe bit into more than just timber. It was rhythm, punishment, ritual, the only thing that made his hands remember they were still his. Inside, Astrid rarely spoke. Since the child's burial, her voice had thinned like the soup they shared. She moved like a ghost, slow and sure, lighting the hearth, mending old furs, boiling seal bones for broth. Her grief had no edges, it simply was. The village changed with the cold. Men once proud and loud had quieted into suspicion. They watched one another closely, counting goats, measuring stores, whispering near doorways. Not every house had enough to last the season, and everyone knew it. One night, Rold's wife came screaming into the square. "The stores are empty," she cried, frost clinging to her shawl. Doors opened. Eyes appeared in the dark. "The dried fish is gone," she sobbed. "And the flour too. Someone's taken it." Rold stormed out moments later, holding an axe. His beard was white with frost, eyes wild with hunger and grief. He accused Bjarnolf, the tanner, of stealing. Bjarnolf denied it. The Jarl was summoned. They gathered in the longhouse under the flickering light of seal oil lamps. No warriors now, just desperate men with cracked lips and hollow cheeks. The Jarl stood beside the hearth. "We are all starving," he said. "But if any man steals from another, he steals from us all." He looked at Bjarnolf, then at Rold. "Do you have proof?" Rold hesitated. "Tracks, leading from the shed to his home." Bjarnolf raised his hands. "My son, he plays in the snow. Those tracks could be his." But suspicion outweighed innocence. The Jarl didn't call for blood. Instead, he ordered Bjarnolf's family to share their stores. "Equally," he said, "until spring." Bjarnolf didn't protest. Not aloud, but Leif saw the hate in his eyes as he turned back toward the door. That night, someone slashed the throat of Bjarnolf's goat. By morning, the animal lay stiff and frozen near the woodpile, its blood staining the snow like spilled wine. No one admitted it, no one spoke of it, but everyone heard. It wasn't war. Not yet. But it was something close. By mid-January, the storms worsened. Winds screamed down from the mountains with teeth. The fjord vanished beneath mist and snow. Ice formed on the inside of window panes. Leif spent nights with his back to the door, axe resting beside him. He heard things outside. Footsteps, breathing, once even a low knock at the frame that never came again. And then, one morning, they found Stig's body. He'd frozen to death beside the forge, curled up with nothing but an old fur across his chest and one hand still clutching a pouch of moldy bread. The healer said he'd likely gone mad, wandered out alone, seeking warmth that wasn't there. But Leif saw something else. The door to Stig's home had been barred from the inside. Someone had locked him out, and no one cried at his burial. No one wept over the great ox of a man who once carried 3 barrels alone, who used to sing so loud during raids the monks in Ireland must have heard him before he arrived. Now he was just another mound beneath the snow, another name whispered by the wind. One evening, as the fire crackled low and the stew boiled thin, Astrid finally spoke. He would have been 7 this week. Leif looked up from the flames. "Our son," she said, her voice brittle. "I dream of him in the snow." Leif said nothing. Words felt like lies now. Instead, he reached out, took her hand, cold, thinner than he remembered, but real. In a world that had taken nearly everything, it was enough. Outside, the wolves howled again, closer this time, as if even the wild things knew the village was wounded, and when spring came, if it came, nothing would be the same again. They say spring brings life, but in the fjord village where life lived, spring came not as a gift, but a reckoning. The snow began to retreat in patches, revealing what the cold had hidden. Rot, ruin, bones in the thickets, bones near the stream, bones in places where no man had spoken of a burial. It was Astrid who found the child's shoe in the woods, torn, faded, half sunk in mud. Not their son's, he'd been buried near the elder tree. This was someone else's, one of the neighbor's children. Leif counted in his mind and realized the village had grown quieter than he'd noticed. Fewer voices, fewer feet running across frozen paths. The hunger had taken them, or someone had. That week, the Jarl called a gathering, not to celebrate the thaw, but to name the missing. They gathered in the longhouse, smoke curling up to the rafters as names were read aloud. 12. 12 souls unaccounted for. A silence settled over the room like dust. Then someone said it aloud, "Wolves don't leave bones stacked neatly." No one argued. What followed wasn't a trial. Not exactly. It was more like a narrowing of eyes, a measuring of silences. They spoke of Bjarnolf again. The tanner. His chimney smoked longer than others. His children looked fuller in the face. His goat had died, but no one had seen where the meat went. That evening, Leif sat on a stone near the edge of the woods, the cat watching smoke rise from Bjarnolf's home. He didn't want to think it, didn't want to speak it. But the village was starving, and not all the bones in the forest belonged to deer. The next morning, they found Bjarnolf gone. No sign of struggle, just his empty house. His children vanished too. The back wall had been broken, planks pried away. A trail of footprints led into the forest and stopped at the edge of the marshes. That was all. Some whispered that he'd fled. Others said something took him. But deep down, most suspected he'd left because he knew what came next. Fire. Torches. Axes. The kind of justice desperate men dealt when laws had frozen with the snow. No one searched for him. Instead, they rebuilt the wall, nailed it shut, and spoke of him only in warnings. Spring brought warmth. The sea softened. The fjord cracked and hissed, and the boats were dragged to shore again. The Jarl began preparations for the next raid. He made his rounds, door to door, naming those who would row, those who would swing axes, those who would carry back food or not return at all. When he reached Leif's door, he didn't knock, just opened it. Astrid stood at the hearth, grinding herbs. Leif sat sharpening his axe. The Jarl looked at both of them and said simply, "You come." Leif nodded. There was no need for a speech, not after what winter had done to them. No need for promises of silver or stories of valor. It was about survival now. If you didn't raid, you didn't eat. If you stayed, you starved. Or worse, you buried your wife, or your wife buried you. That night, Leif sat by the edge of the fjord watching the water. The longboat lay there, quiet, skeletal, waiting. He remembered the first time he set sail. He'd been 20, full of rage, full of belief. He thought the sea was a path to greatness. Now it just looked like another kind of grave. Still, when the sun rose, he was there, paddle in hand, boots wet, face to the wind. The others joined one by one. Rolled, two younger boys barely grown, an old man with one eye and a half-healed burn across his neck. The Jarl stood at the bow, silent, waiting. Then they pushed off. The fjord opened its mouth once again, and the men disappeared into it like ghosts returning to their tomb. Back home, Astrid lit the fire. She stirred the pot and waited, because that's all the North ever taught its people. To wait, to endure, to disappear. And hope, just maybe, that when the snow returned, they'd have something to burn. The sea was a mirror that morning. No wind, no waves, just stillness, the kind that made even seasoned raiders nervous. The longboat cut through it like a blade, oars creaking in rhythm. Leif sat second from the bow, fingers wrapped tight around the shaft of his paddle. His hands ached from the cold, even in the dawn light, but he said nothing. No one did. Raiding wasn't war, not anymore. It was desperation. It was pulling a splintered boat across an endless expanse of salt water for the chance, just the chance, that someone else's village was doing slightly better than yours. The gods weren't with them. The gods had starved, bled, and frozen just like everyone else. By midday, the wind returned. It came slow and warm, pushing the boat farther south. The Jarl stood up, pointing at the horizon where the coast curved like a crooked tooth. "That's where we land," he said. "Small monastery, no walls, soft priests." He said it like they were hunting sheep. Leif didn't care what it was, he just wanted food. They beached at dusk. The monastery stood quiet on a hill, its stone walls glowing orange in the dying sun. One bell tower, no guards, a few candlelit windows. There was a field of herbs behind it and chickens clucking softly near the side gate. It looked like something from a dream. The Jarl grinned. Perfect. But as they crept closer, Leif felt it, something wrong. The air was too still, no dogs barking, no distant chant or evening bells. He knocked on the door with the butt of his axe. Nothing. Bjorn, the youngest among them, pushed it open, and that's when they saw the bodies. They hadn't been the first ones there. The priests had been killed days ago, throats slashed, some burned, others left rotting under overturned benches. Whoever raided before them hadn't just stolen gold. They'd stayed for a while, pillaged everything. Even the wine was gone. The storerooms were empty. The pantry had mice. The smokehouse had ash. Leif stood in the nave, staring at a wooden crucifix that hung upside down above the altar. Blood was smeared across the walls in what looked like symbols, not Norse, not Christian, just madness. They were tortured, said Rold. The Jarl didn't seem to care. The wood, the tools, anything left. There wasn't much. A broken cart, some iron nails, one half-filled bag of barley that had rats inside. They made camp outside the monastery, silent around the fire. "Even the gods are starving," Bjorn muttered, his voice barely above the wind. Leif didn't respond. In his mind, he kept seeing the face of one of the monks. A boy, really, no older than 15. His eyes had been open, mouth frozen mid-scream. As if he hadn't just died. He'd remembered dying. That night they buried the bodies. Not for mercy. Not for forgiveness. Just so the wolves wouldn't find them. The return voyage was worse. A storm rose out of nowhere. Black clouds slamming across the water with thunder that sounded like war drums. The boat rocked, nearly tipped. Bjorn was washed overboard before anyone could grab him. They didn't even hear him scream. Just the splash, and then the sea took him. By the time they reached the fjord again, only 6 men remained. The Jarl had a wound on his side from the mast's collapse. He tried to hide it, but by the time they hauled the boat ashore, he was coughing blood. Rold carried him to the healer. Leif stood at the dock, dripping wet, his face blank as driftwood. Astrid met him at the path. No words, just an arm around his waist as he limped toward home. Inside, the hearth was lit. The stew pot steamed gently. It smelled of fish and herbs. "Where?" he managed. "A trade," she said. "Old Sigrid had salt. I had thread." They sat together and ate slowly, the firelight flickering across their hollow cheeks. "I thought you'd bring something back," she said after a while. "I did," he answered. "I brought myself." In the weeks that followed, the Jarl died. His body was burned with full rites, though no one celebrated. Rold took his place, but no one envied him. Spring had come, but the earth refused to yield. The soil had frozen deep, and the seeds rotted in the ground. Fish were fewer this year, the goats sicklier, and rumors spread of a new sickness in the next valley, something that blackened the skin and made men bleed from the eyes. People began to wonder if they were cursed, if the gods had turned their backs. But Leaf, he no longer prayed. He just sharpened his axe because he knew something now. Survival wasn't about gods or glory. It was about endurance, about staying just long enough to see another storm pass and praying it didn't have your name on it. By midsummer, the fjord had turned green around the edges, not with grass or bounty, but with mold. The barrels of barley brought down from the Jarl's old storehouse had spoiled. Too damp, too long in storage. The village had hoped for beer. Instead, they had rot, sickness, and rats bold enough to bite sleeping children. Leaf spent his mornings in silence. He patched nets no one used anymore, sharpened blades no one had the strength to lift. He checked the traps along the ridge and returned empty-handed every time. Birds had grown quiet. Rabbits disappeared. Even the crows had left. Astrid still spoke little. She moved through the day like it was something to be endured. When she smiled, if she smiled, it was the faint curve of someone who once knew joy but no longer trusted it. Their neighbors fared no better. Rold, now the Jarl in name only, walked the village like a man waiting for a sentence. He'd once been broad and thunder-voiced, but now he hunched with the weight of too many silent deaths. When people asked for help, grain, wood, cloth, he only shook his head. He had nothing left to give. One morning, the village bell rang. 3 times. Not a call to worship, a call to gather. They met near the center, 27 of them, down from nearly 50 the year before. Rold stood by the old stone well, holding a torn boot. This was found at the edge of the woods, he said. The tracks were too small for a man, a child's. Whispers bloomed like rot. Some thought it was wolves, others a wild man. Some even muttered of Draugr, the dead who walk. No one laughed at that suggestion. Then someone asked, "Who's missing?" No one answered. They all began counting in their minds, and then a voice rose. Inga. Leaf turned toward the voice. Old Sigrid, eyes full of fear. Inga, she repeated. The blacksmith's daughter. She was at my home just 2 days ago. I gave her broth. They searched the woods that night, torches and blades in hand. Not warriors, just survivors pretending to still be brave. They found nothing, no body, no blood, only a second boot half submerged in moss. They didn't search the next night. Some things, they decided, didn't want to be found. Weeks passed. The village shrank further, not in size, but in soul. No children laughed anymore. No stories were told by the fire. People moved with the quiet deliberation of those trying not to be seen by something watching. Then one dawn, Astrid woke Leaf with a whisper. Someone's outside. He sat up, hand on his axe. He listened. At first, nothing. Then, scraping, not claws, not tools, fingernails. He rose, moved toward the door. When he opened it, there was no one there. But something had been. Scratches lined the door frame, desperate, uneven, and low, as if made by someone on their knees, or smaller. Leaf stepped out barefoot, the mist curling around his legs. No tracks. Only frost where the earth should have been warm. He didn't speak of it to anyone. Neither did Astrid. Some knowledge was poison. That afternoon, a stranger arrived. No boat, no horse, just a man in a torn cloak, limping from the path beyond the ridge, carrying nothing but a sack over one shoulder and a rusted blade at his hip. Rold met him at the path. Who are you? Traveler, the man rasped. You have no kin here. I have news. He was taken to the longhouse, fed broth, given furs. Leaf joined the others who gathered to listen. The man's voice was cracked like old wood. There's plague, he said. Across the coast. Black boils, bleeding eyes, farms are burning their sick. Villages vanish overnight. They say it came from a port ship. Some call it a curse from the south. A silence fell. How far? Someone asked. 2 days' walk, the man said. Maybe less. He finished the broth, closed his eyes, then died before nightfall. No scream, no thrashing, just stillness. They burned his body, didn't even wait for sunrise. In the days that followed, no one left their homes after dusk. Not from fear of wolves, not even fear of plague, but because something had changed in the air. The wind no longer carried the smell of salt. The earth refused to bloom. Even the bees had vanished, and every night someone claimed to hear the scratching, always at the door, always low to the ground. Leaf began sleeping with his axe again. Astrid whispered names in her sleep, names that didn't belong to anyone still living, and when the crows finally returned, they didn't land. They just circled, waiting. The village stopped pretending to be a village. What once had been a network of homes and neighbors slowly became something else. Silent thresholds, shuttered windows, and eyes that avoided each other even in daylight. The people didn't gather anymore. The bell tower stood still. Children no longer played because the children were gone. One by one, no screams, no blood trails, just small shapes under small blankets that failed to move by morning, or empty beds with hand-stitched dolls left behind. No explanations, no morning feasts, only burials. Shallow, quick, unmarked. Leaf dug to himself. Not for his own, not yet, but for his friend's twins, both gone on the same frost-laced dawn. He helped carry them to the elder tree hill. The ground had softened just enough. Still, the earth wept black water when they dug. Fever, their mother had said. But Leif saw no fever in their eyes. He saw something worse. Astrid no longer spun flax. She watched the woods. Every day she would sit near the fire, face turned toward the thick pine wall beyond their home where the trees pressed close. She watched with the patience of someone who expected something terrible but didn't know when. One morning, Leif found her outside before sunrise. She stood barefoot in the frost, arms limp at her sides. He called her name. She didn't turn, just stared. Leif followed her gaze. There, near the edge of the trees, stood a figure, small, still. A girl, hair pale, dressed too thin. It was Inga, the blacksmith's daughter, who'd vanished, but her face was wrong. It didn't move, didn't blink. Her arms hung like forgotten branches. She didn't shiver. Leif stepped forward. Inga? The figure stepped back and vanished into the trees without a sound. Astrid began to cry, though no tears came. I saw her yesterday, too, she whispered. Behind the goat pen, watching. Rold called another gathering. This time only 12 showed. The rest were sick, missing, or too afraid to leave their homes. The dead don't stay dead, he said. Something's wrong here, and it started after we returned from the monastery. No one argued. Someone mentioned the blood symbols on the walls. Someone else whispered about the upside-down crucifix. Then old Sigrid stood. She told me, she said. Her voice shook, not with fear, but something worse, certainty. I saw her, my sister, dead 40 winters now. She came to my window, said we brought something back, something we never meant to. The others stared. Rold clenched his jaw. Ghosts? No, Sigrid said. Not ghosts. Memory. We didn't just bring blood home. We brought remembrance. The place remembers what we did. That night, the scratching returned, not at Leif's door, at his window. It came like a slow thought, barely audible, a single fingertip trailing along the wood frame. Astrid held his arm, eyes wide, breath caught in her chest. He stood, axe in hand, and pulled open the shutter. Nothing. Just dark trees, still wind. Then he saw it. Bare footprints in the frost, too small to be his, too deep to be a bird's. They led away from the house toward the ridge. He didn't follow. The next morning, smoke rose over Rold's home. By the time Leif arrived, it was ash. No one inside. Just charred beams, blackened stones, and something carved in the ground near the threshold. Not runes, not Christian marks, just a handprint, deep, burned into the dirt like it had been pressed there by a coal-hot hand. The villagers stood in a ring around the ruin. No one cried. No one asked where Rold had gone. They all knew the answer. Days passed without sun. The mist never lifted. The trees began to sweat resin that stank like old blood. People burned their idols. Their gods were silent. And still, each night, the scratching. Leif stopped opening the door. He didn't need to see anymore. He knew what was out there. And worse, he knew why it came. They hadn't just stolen gold from that monastery. They'd awakened something ancient, something the monks had locked away in silence and ash and forgotten words, something that now remembered its name. He didn't say it aloud, not yet, but the words sat in his chest like a coal, waiting to burn. It was Leif who first noticed the shadows were moving wrong, not the ordinary shifting of firelight on stone, not the innocent waver of pine trees in the wind. This was deeper, like the very light had become unsure of itself. He would turn to grab an axe and swear something stood behind him. Gone when he faced it. Always just gone. He stopped trusting reflections, in water, in windows, in the polished blade of his seeks. His eyes looked too wide, too still, and sometimes they didn't blink when he did. Astrid had begun to whisper in her sleep, not in Norse, not in Latin, something older, harsher. Her tongue clicked and hissed like dry leaves scraping stone. Leif would gently wake her, and she'd blink, confused, unaware she'd spoken at all. The village had stopped speaking of Inga, or Rold, or the traveler who had died after bringing news of plague. Everyone seemed to understand that whatever had begun on the coast had never truly left. It had followed them, not like a storm or sickness, but like a grudge. Something had been unburied, something that did not forgive. One evening, as the last blue of daylight died, a knock came at Leif's door. Not a scratching, not the childlike clawing they'd grown used to. A solid, slow knock. 3 times. He rose. Astrid clutched his sleeve. He opened it. Einar, the old fisherman, stood there. Alone, soaked from the river path, eyes wild and yellowed like an animal's. "They're under the ground," he said. Leif said nothing. Einar swayed forward, voice cracked. "Not just the dead, the first ones, the ones who sang to the dirt. I heard them. At the river mouth, they were humming. And the fish, Leif, the fish were bleeding before I caught them." He fell forward into Leif's arms, bones sharp as driftwood, breath wheezing. It's not hunger anymore. It's remembering, but the land remembers. Astrid brought broth. Einar drank, staring at the fire like it might leap and speak. That night he slept on their floor. By morning he was gone. Not dead. Gone. As if he'd never been there at all. His bedroll untouched, bowl still half full, only his boots remained, standing neatly near the door, still wet with river mud. The frost came early, a thick, bitter crust that refused to melt. Even the goats' water pails froze solid before noon. Fires became harder to start, harder to feed. Wood smoked more than it burned. The villagers began carving symbols into their doors. Not runes. Newer things. Circles with jagged edges. Some had eyes. Some had no beginning or end. Leif saw one etched into a tree near the stream, bleeding sap like tears. He didn't ask who carved them. Everyone had started dreaming the same dreams. Of a door. Stone and black, half buried. And something knocking from inside. Astrid began building a wall, not around the house. Around the hearth, stones from the garden path, clay from the creek, she stacked them carefully, humming quietly to herself, sealing the fire into a little fortress. When Leif asked why, she only said, "The warmth doesn't belong to us anymore." He didn't argue, because that night, when the fire went out, the room didn't grow cold. It grew wrong, like warmth had been replaced by breath, the kind of breath that fogged the windows from the outside. Old Sigrid died in her sleep. They buried her in silence. No rites, no fire, just earth and fear. And when they placed her beneath the dirt, they found 3 sets of footprints circling the grave. All bare, all small, as if someone or something had come to watch. That night the scratching returned, but now it came from the roof, from the cellar, from the inside walls. Leif and Astrid sat back to back, axes drawn, staring into the shadows. The fire refused to catch, the air tasted like iron, and the dreams that followed were not dreams. They were invitations. Sometime near midnight, Astrid whispered, "I saw the door again." Leif didn't move. "In my sleep," she said. But it wasn't sleep. I was under the village. There were tunnels, like veins, and the door, it opened. She paused. There was no light inside, but I could hear it, breathing. "Leif, it knows your name." He finally turned to look at her, and in that moment her eyes were not her own. They were wide, all pupil, all shadow, and they did not blink when he did. Leif didn't sleep that night. He sat in the corner of the hearth's crumbling circle, axe in hand, staring not at the door but at Astrid. She slept facing the wall, her breath slow, regular. But now and then her lips moved. No sound came out, just the shape of a word her mouth kept repeating. A name, not his, not hers, something ancient, with too many syllables and no vowels. He wanted to wake her. He wanted to shake her. But something inside told him not to, that if she opened her eyes just then, he might not recognize what was looking back. So he stayed still and watched the shadows move again. Not like mist, not like flame, like limbs, crawling, reaching, searching. By dawn, the mist had thickened into a colorless mass that clung to the ground like old wool. You couldn't see more than 10 paces in any direction. The village paths were silent, doors barred, windows covered with cloth soaked in ash. Leif stepped outside and found a row of footprints leading away from his door. Child-sized, bare, and when he followed them to the edge of the trees, he saw dozens more, leading inward, like a pilgrimage. He didn't go in. He wasn't ready to follow that path, not yet. But he knew, soon, he'd have no choice. By midday, another home had gone quiet, the old weaver's. Her loom had stood by the open window for as long as anyone could remember, always clicking, creaking, clacking with threads and songs. But today it was still, not just unmoving, gone. The window shuttered, no smoke from the chimney. Leaf and two others approached. No response to their knocking, so they entered. Inside, every wall was covered with thread. Not cloth, not tapestries. Just thread, crisscrossing like spider silk, pulled tight from floor to ceiling. It shimmered in the light, humming faintly like a plucked harp string. And at the center of the room where the hearth should have been was a hole, perfectly round, deep, dark, and full of that same whispering mist. And the weaver? Gone. All that remained was her comb and a single red strand clutched in the teeth of a dead bird on the windowsill. They sealed the home and never spoke of it again. That night, the dreams changed. Leaf didn't dream of the door. He dreamed of beneath it. He was falling, forever, but not fast, like sinking in honey. And far below he saw the village from above, turned inside out, its houses inverted into caverns, its roads twisting into roots. And at the center, not the well, but another well, older, deeper, breathing. And something was rising from it. He woke with blood in his mouth. Astrid was already awake, sitting by the window, staring out. "They've started singing," she said. He listened. Faint. So faint. Children's voices. Not happy ones. Chanting. Something like a lullaby twisted into a threat. He stepped closer and she said, "Don't. They'll hear you. If you listen too hard, you remember." The next day, the villagers gathered again. Only 8 came. The rest had either disappeared or refused to leave their homes. Someone finally asked, "Should we leave?" But Leaf said what they all knew. There's nowhere to go. The fjord had grown still. No wind, no birds, no boats had come or gone in weeks. And the forest was no longer safe. Those who'd gone in hadn't returned. And one had. Last week, bent backwards, smiling. No one mentioned that. Old Sigurd's grave opened itself. No one dug. They found it half sunken one morning, as if something beneath had stirred. The earth cracked like broken pottery, and inside no body, only her shawl folded neatly with a smooth, wet stone sitting on top. Life picked it up and dropped it immediately. It was warm. That evening, Astrid didn't speak. She just carved something into the floorboards with her fingernails, a spiral. No beginning, no end. Just turning, turning, turning. Leaf tried to stop her. Her hands bled. She didn't flinch. He finally pulled her away, wrapped her fingers, and carried her to bed. She didn't resist, just whispered, "It's almost open now." That night, the scratching didn't come from the walls. It came from under the bed. A soft tapping. Then a low giggle. Then silence. Leaf didn't move. He just watched the fire die again. By morning, they found a new door. Not to a house, but in the hill, just behind the elder tree where the Jarl's sons were buried. A slit like a mouth yawning open in the stone. And inside, just blackness. Warm blackness, as if something was breathing out into the air. The moss had receded from the stones. The ground around the door was dry. Too dry. As if it had been burned. And carved on the lintel of the stone frame was a name. Leaf didn't say it, but he knew it. It was the same name Astrid whispered in her sleep. The name the wind had begun to murmur. The name no one had taught him, but he had always known. And now, so did the earth. The villagers didn't speak of the door, not in the way they spoke of harvests, of sickness, of wolves, or war. They felt it instead, like a second heartbeat in the village soil, pulsing low and steady beneath their boots. The kind of sound that isn't sound at all, but something deeper, like gravity, like guilt. Leaf stood before it the morning after it opened. The wind didn't blow there. The trees held still. Even the crows were silent. The stone entrance was squat and narrow, no taller than a man's chest, just wide enough to crawl through. It didn't look old. It looked freshly made, as if carved last night by something that had been waiting just below the surface, something that wasn't finished yet. Astrid hadn't spoken since the night she carved the spiral. She moved through the house like a ghost, hair unbraided, feet bare, humming softly, not a tune, just a rhythm. Sometimes she would pause and stare at a corner or the rafters as if seeing things life could not. When he asked if she dreamed again, she only nodded. "They're not dreams anymore," she said. "They're rehearsals." 3 more homes emptied that week. No broken doors, no cries for help, just missing. In each one, the hearth was cold, the beds made, the floors clean. Too clean. Swept like someone preparing for a guest or a sacrifice. And always, always, the spiral. Scratched into the floorboards, into tabletops, burned into the walls with soot and nail marks. Even the children had begun to draw them in the dirt with sticks. One boy sat in the snow for hours, drawing circles with a bone, whispering, She's coming back. She promised to bring the song this time. When asked who she was, he blinked once and bit his own tongue until it bled. Leif tried to speak to the others, to rally them, but there were only 5 left who would meet his eyes. Tova, the beekeeper's widow, Ulf, who'd lost 3 children and never wept, Bruni, the smith with burn scars over half his face, Greta, who hadn't spoken aloud in years but now wouldn't stop whispering to trees, and Eric, whose laughter had turned into a bark. They sat around the cold hearth in Leif's home. The fire refused to catch. Tova finally said it aloud, "It wants us to go inside." The others went quiet, not because they disagreed, but because they already knew. Astrid stood at the door when Leif returned from the woods, not the stone door, the door to their home. She was barefoot again, standing in the snow, palms upward, and her eyes were leaking black. Not blood, not tears. Something darker, thicker, as if memory itself had turned to liquid and begun seeping out of her. When he ran to her, she smiled. "Leif," she said, "I remember the shape of the songs now. I think they were always in us, like marrow." Then she collapsed. He carried her inside. She did not wake that night. The scratching returned, not from inside the walls, not this time, from the ground, under the bed, under the hearth, under everything, like fingers on the underside of a coffin. The walls began to sweat. First moisture, then red. Thin red lines that traced the old wood and dripped down, pooling near the spiral Astrid had carved. He tried to scrub it away. It kept returning, and beneath it he heard the name again. That same word. The one without vowels. The one that knew him. By morning, Astrid was gone, not vanished, gone. Her clothes folded on the bed, her braid coiled neatly on the pillow, her boots beside the door, and on the table, carved with something sharp, were 4 words. She sang me home. Leif didn't cry, he didn't scream. He took his axe and walked to the stone door. Inside was not what he expected. It wasn't a tunnel or a crypt, it was a room, circular, perfectly smooth walls, like glass but not cold. The floor pulsed faintly beneath his feet, and the air was thick, not with rot, but with something sweet. Like honey turned sour. The walls were covered in faces, pressed into the stone, half-formed. Some had eyes, some didn't. All were familiar. He saw Astrid, he saw Hrold, he saw himself, and in the center of the chamber stood a single wooden stool. On it, a child, pale, still. Inga. She opened her eyes. "Do you remember the song yet?" she asked. Leif dropped the axe, because he did. He remembered, not the words, the shape of the song, the rhythm of the earth, the spiral of history. He knelt, and when the chamber pulsed again, he didn't resist. He sang. The village is still there, but no one lives in it. Smoke rises from chimneys that never run out of wood, voices hum from wells that hold no water. And travelers who pass by swear they hear children laughing beneath the ground. But no one dares knock, because the door is always open now, and it's waiting for someone to remember the rest of the song. The village was caught in the silence between heartbeats, as if the earth itself held its breath. Leif wandered through the empty streets, the snow crunching beneath his boots, the spiral marks carved deep into frozen wood and stone alike. He traced the patterns with a trembling hand, feeling the cold bite into his skin, a warning or perhaps a reminder, something alive beneath the surface. The stone door stood stubborn and still at the edge of the village, a mouth half open, inviting and terrible. The wind refused to pass through it, bending instead around the carved edges, carrying with it a scent of honey and rot. It called to something ancient in Leif's blood, something he had fought to forget. In the mead hall, the hearth had long since gone cold. The few who remained avoided its ghostly glow, gathering instead in corners where shadows crept like whispered fears. Tova sat with her hands wrapped around a wooden cup, her eyes glazed and distant, murmuring prayers to gods no one. The wind outside the mead hall howled like a wild beast, rattling the timbers and setting the smoke to twisting in jagged spirals through the narrow windows. Leif sat alone by the fire, the dull glow illuminating his weathered face, deep with lines carved by years at sea and more recently by the heavy burden of memory. The warmth did little to chase away the cold that clung to his bones, a cold that was not born of winter's chill but of something deeper, darker. His hands rested on the rough wood of the table, fingers tracing the worn grain as if it might anchor him to the world of the living. Yet, the song from the stone chamber still echoed in his mind, a haunting melody that stirred something restless and ancient within his chest. Around him, the village lay quiet. The fires in the hearth sputtered low. The faces of his kin were turned inward, their eyes shadowed by the same dread that gnawed at Leif's soul. The sea beyond the cliffs churned beneath a slate-gray sky, its endless motion a cruel reminder of the fate that awaited those who sought to tame it. He thought of the raids, the blood, the glory sung by skalds, but also of the silence that followed. The empty villages, the cold hearths, the mothers who wept for sons swallowed by the waves or lost in the tangled web of vengeance. The songs told of conquest, but never of the weight that settled afterward like a shroud. Leif's gaze drifted to the weapons laid carefully on the wall. Swords dulled by rust, shields cracked and faded. They had carried him through battles and betrayals alike, but now they felt like relics of a past that no longer fit the man he had become. Outside, a raven's call cut through the night, sharp and mournful. Leif rose and stepped to the door, pushing it open against the wind. The world beyond was vast and unforgiving. Wild forests, dark as ink, jagged rocks white with frost, and the ceaseless sea stretching to horizons that blurred in the mist. He wrapped his cloak tighter and looked up to the stars, scattered like cold embers against the black velvet sky. Somewhere, he thought, the song awaited him still, woven into the fabric of the land and sea, waiting for his voice to join the ancient chorus. But the price of that song was steep, and not all who heard it lived to sing. Leif closed the door and returned to the fire, the flickering flames casting shadows that danced like ghosts upon the walls. He was a Viking, a raider, a bearer of old tales, but he was also a man marked by loss and haunted by silence. And in that silence, the song was waiting for someone brave enough to carry its sorrow forward. Days slipped like shadows through the narrow village streets, growing longer and colder as the sun sank behind jagged mountains. The villagers, already hollowed by fear and loss, moved like ghosts, their faces etched with quiet desperation. Leif wandered among them, feeling the weight of their silence pressing down like the thick, damp fog that clung to the woods. The mead hall, once a place of warmth and laughter, now stood heavy with absence. Its walls, darkened by smoke and sorrow, seemed to hold on to secrets that no one dared speak aloud. Weapons hung on racks, forgotten and gathering dust, their edges dulled by disuse, silent witnesses to battles fought long ago, both without and within. Leif's hands trembled as he lifted his old sword from its resting place. The metal was cold and rough beneath his fingers, the grip worn smooth by years of use. It felt foreign now, an artifact from a life that had slipped away like sand through his grasp. The tales of glory, the roars of victory, they had grown thin, fading echoes lost in the cold wind. Outside, the sea whispered endlessly against the cliffs, its voice both comforting and cruel. It was a reminder that beneath the waves lay the bones of comrades, swallowed by storms or betrayed by treachery. Some nights Leif dreamt of their faces, pale and silent beneath dark waters, calling to him with voices like distant thunder. In the village square, Tova moved among the few remaining, her hands busy weaving beeswax candles, their faint glow barely piercing the gloom. She spoke little, but when she did, her words were sharp, cutting through the haze of despair like a blade. Her eyes held storms, fierce and unyielding, reflecting the sorrow that bound them all. One evening, as twilight bled into night, a distant howl shattered the quiet. The wolves had returned, drawn by hunger and the scent of abandonment. The villagers shuttered their homes, clutching old talismans and whispered prayers, hoping the darkness would not claim more. Leif stood at the edge of the forest, watching shadows dance beneath twisted branches. The song from the stone chamber haunted him still, a melody not of triumph, but of loss and remembrance. He knew that the village, caught between worlds, held its breath, waiting for the song to be sung again. But who would sing it? Who among the broken could bear the weight of memory? Leif sheathed his sword and walked back to the mead hall, the chill biting deeper with every step. The night stretched before him, endless and quiet, a canvas for the ghosts of the past and the fragile hope of what might come. In the stillness, the spiral waited, and somewhere beneath the earth, the song stirred once more. The days grew shorter, the sun dipping beneath the horizon earlier, casting long shadows over the village that seemed to deepen the silence rather than dispel it. The air was thick with a stillness that unsettled the soul, as if the very earth held its breath, waiting. In the mead hall, the few who remained gathered around a dying fire, their faces gaunt, eyes hollow, voices low with a fear they could not name. Leif sat among them, shoulders heavy with the weight of what he had seen, what he had heard. The stone door and its haunting chamber lingered in his mind like a wound that refused to close. The faces pressed into the walls, half-formed familiar, haunted his dreams and thoughts alike. He could no longer tell where the village ended and the memory began. Tova was the first to break the silence one evening, her voice rough and raw. "We cannot wait for the song to come to us. We must sing it, even if it breaks us." The others nodded, but none spoke. There was a gathering storm in their hearts, a tempest of grief and fear tangled with the fragile hope Tova's words ignited. Greta, who rarely uttered a sound, now whispered to the trees outside, her voice thin but steady, weaving words like a prayer or a spell. Leif stood and walked outside, the cold biting through his cloak. The village lay under a heavy sky, thick with rolling clouds that threatened rain or worse. He walked to the stone door, now faintly glowing beneath the fading light. The spiral carved into its surface seemed to pulse with a slow, breathing rhythm, alive. He placed his hand on the cold stone, feeling the heartbeat beneath. The song called to him again, a low hum in the marrow of his bones. He remembered Astrid's words, that the songs were always inside them, like marrow. But how to sing a song that was woven from loss? That was when the first drop of rain fell, soft and cold. Then another and another. The storm was coming, not of wind and rain alone, but something older. The villagers moved hurriedly to secure their homes, but the air was thick with unease. Leif knew this was more than weather. It was a reckoning. The spirals carved in every corner seemed to glow faintly beneath the rain, glowing like embers in the gathering dark. And beneath the earth, the song waited, growing louder. Leif looked up at the sky, the wind beginning to howl through the bare branches. He whispered into the storm, "I am ready." The storm rolled over the village like a living thing, heavy and slow, pressing against the fragile bones of the houses. The rain began as a whisper, soft droplets tracing slow paths down the carved spirals on walls and doors, until it grew into a relentless hammering, drowning out every other sound. Thunder rumbled distant and deep, like the growl of some ancient beast awakening beneath the earth. Inside the mead hall, the few villagers who remained huddled close, their faces pale in the flickering firelight. The air was thick with damp and fear, the shadows cast by the flames long and trembling on the wooden beams. Tova knelt near the hearth, murmuring prayers to gods old as the stones themselves, while Greta stood at the window, her breath fogging the glass as her fingers traced the spiral etched into the wood. Leif paced slowly, the weight of the axe in his hands a steady anchor amidst the chaos of his thoughts. The chamber beneath the stone door haunted him still, the faces pressed into its walls seeming to call to him from the depths of memory and grief. Astrid's disappearance, the whispers in the night, the black tears she shed, all clung to him like wet cloth. Outside, the wind roared, carrying with it a strange scent, sweet and sour like honey gone bad, just as he remembered from that glowing room. The village seemed to breathe with the storm, the earth itself swelling and pulsing beneath their feet. Leif stepped toward the door, feeling the pull of something older than fear, older than man. His fingers brushed the cold stone, and the spirals seemed to thrum beneath his touch. The pulse echoed the beat of his heart, steady, insistent, a call that no man could ignore. He closed his eyes and listened. The song was there, beneath the rain, beneath the roar of the wind. It was waiting for him to sing it, to give voice to the sorrow that bound them all. The villagers gathered behind him, drawn by the silence, their faces pale and expectant. Tova's voice rose, steady and low, weaving words that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Greta joined her, and one by one others found their voices, their fear giving way to something raw and necessary. Leif sang, the axe resting against the stone, his voice cracking with years of grief and longing. The song filled the air, a haunting melody that reached into the soil, into the cold bones buried beneath the village. The storm raged around them, but inside the song grew stronger, wrapping them in its mournful embrace. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm stilled. The rain softened to a gentle patter, and the wind hushed to a sigh. The spirals on the stone door glowed faintly one last time, then faded into the cold gray of dawn. Leif opened his eyes. The village was still. But something had changed. The weight of the past had shifted. The song had been sung, and now they could begin to remember. The dawn crept slowly over the horizon, bleeding soft hues of pink and gray into the cold sky. The village, shrouded in mist and silence, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the world to wake anew. Leaf stood outside the mead hall, the weight of the night's song still heavy in his chest. The fire's warmth had faded, but the embers of something ancient glowed quietly within him. The earth beneath his feet no longer felt like a cage, but like a memory, fragile yet persistent. Around him, the villagers emerged from their homes, like shadows fleeing darkness, tentative and uncertain. Faces once hollow with fear now flickered with the faintest spark of life. Tova met his gaze, her eyes clearer, steadier. Greta's whispered prayers had softened into murmurs of hope. Even Eric's laughter, once a bark, carried a strange lightness, like the cracking of ice after a long winter. Leaf felt the burden ease just enough to breathe. The song had reached them, not as a curse, but as a call, a chance to reclaim what was lost beneath the soil and silence. He walked toward the stone door, now dull and cold in the pale morning light. The spiral carved upon it seemed less a wound and more a promise, etched in bone and stone, waiting for those brave enough to remember. He knelt and pressed his palm once more, feeling the slow pulse beneath the surface. The village was not forgotten. It was only waiting, waiting for those who dared to sing again. Behind him, the villagers gathered, their voices soft but growing stronger. They formed a circle, hands linked, faces lifted toward the waking sky. Together, they began to sing, not the haunting melody from the chamber below, but a new song. One of loss, yes, but also of hope and survival, of roots digging deep and growing toward light. The air shifted, the mist began to lift, the village stirred as if waking from a long and troubled dream. Leaf stood, the first true light of remembering shining in his eyes. The spiral had not claimed them, it had chosen them, and the song would live on. The morning unfolded like a fragile whisper, the village slowly stirring beneath a sky smeared with pale gold and mist. The cold that had once clung like a shroud now softened to a biting chill, tempered by the first fragile warmth of day. The spirals etched in wood and stone no longer seemed ominous. They pulsed faintly, a subtle rhythm in sync with the slow awakening of life. Leaf moved through the village like a man returned from a long voyage, not across seas, but through memory itself. The faces of those around him bore marks of sorrow, but also a glimmer of resolve, as if the long silence had finally been broken. In the mead hall, Tova gathered herbs and beeswax, her hands steady despite the tremor in her voice when she spoke of healing. Outside, Greta wandered the edges of the woods, her whispers now prayers of thanks and renewal. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches heavy with the burden of ancient stories. Even Eric, whose laughter had once barked harshly like a cornered beast, now smiled, a quiet, cautious smile that suggested a crack in the armor of despair. Leif found himself drawn again to the stone door. The once foreboding threshold now felt less like a barrier and more like a threshold, a fragile gateway between the village's past and its uncertain future. Kneeling, he laid his palm on the cold surface. The pulse beneath the stone was steady, a heartbeat in the quiet earth. He closed his eyes, and the song returned, not as a distant echo, but as a living thread weaving through his veins. It was a melody of roots and rain, of loss and persistence, whispered by the soil and sung by the wind. Behind him, the villagers began to gather. Word spread quickly, like the gentle stirring of a new wind. They came not with fear, but with a fragile hope. Men and women whose hands bore the calluses of toil, whose eyes held the weight of grief, yet also the spark of defiance. Around the stone door, they formed a circle. Their voices lifted tentatively at first, blending into a soft hum that grew with each breath, each heartbeat. The song was theirs now, shaped by their sorrow, their strength, their will to endure. Leaf's voice rose above the rest, steady and sure, carrying the melody into the sky. The wind answered, weaving through the trees and over the hills, carrying the song beyond the village boundaries, beyond memory itself. The earth beneath their feet seemed to respond, a gentle tremor, like the pulse of a giant waking from slumber. The spirals glowed faintly, casting a soft light that mingled with the dawn, bathing the faces of the villagers in a glow both eerie and beautiful. For the first time in what felt like an age, the village breathed. The long night of silence was ending, and with it the beginning of something fragile, new, a promise written not in stone but in song. The village awoke beneath a sky blushed faintly by the rising sun, its light weaving gold and amber across the frost-kissed rooftops. The air held a crispness mingled with the scent of damp earth and smoldering wood. the promise of renewal whispered in every breath. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet tension lingered, a reminder that the song they had begun was only the first step through darkness. Leif moved slowly through the waking streets, his boots stirring soft clouds of frost from the packed earth. Around him, villagers stirred from long shadows, their faces a mixture of cautious hope and lingering fear. The spirals carved deep into doorframes and beams seemed to pulse with a subtle energy, like the heartbeat of the land itself, fragile but relentless. Tova stood at the well, drawing water with steady hands. Her eyes, once glazed with sorrow, now reflected the steady flame of determination. She spoke little, but the gentle strength in her presence grounded those around her. Greta, moving between patches of frozen earth and budding grass, whispered old prayers to the soil, coaxing life from the reluctant ground. Leif's thoughts drifted back to the stone chamber, the faces pressed into its walls like fragile memories trapped in cold glass. The song they sang had not erased the past, nor the loss that shadowed every breath, but it had opened a door, a crack through which light might finally enter. He stood once more before the door that breathed its surface cool beneath his palm. The spirals glowed faintly, a slow, steady pulse in tune with his heartbeat. He closed his eyes and let the melody rise again, feeling it stretch through him like roots seeking earth. Behind him, the village gathered. This time, more joined. Women with worn hands, men with faces weathered by wind and grief. The song swelled, a fragile chorus weaving through the cold morning air. It was not a song of triumph, but of endurance, a solemn hymn for those who had fallen and those still standing. The earth trembled gently beneath their feet as if acknowledging their vow. The spirals on walls and stones shone brighter, casting dancing shadows that flickered like ancient spirits come to witness the rite. Leif's voice wavered, then steadied, carrying the melody with a weight he had never known. It was a song of loss and remembrance, but also of hope, a vow that even in silence, life finds a way to sing. As the last notes faded into the morning, the villagers stood in silence, breath mingling with the cold air, hearts beating in unison with the slow pulse beneath the land. The spiral had claimed their sorrow, but it had also offered a seed of light. Leif looked to the horizon, where the first rays of sun pierced the lingering mist. The village was no longer a ghost trapped beneath the earth. It was a fragile ember, ready to kindle into flame. The song would carry on, and they would remember. The days that followed wore on like a slow ache, each dawn a fragile thread unraveling the long night that bound the village in shadows. The cold began to relent, but not entirely. The air still carried a sharpness, a reminder that even in rebirth, hardship clung like a stubborn frost. The villagers moved through their daily rhythms with tentative steps, their eyes bright with cautious hope, but still haunted by what had been lost. Leif found himself restless, torn between the comforting pull of the mead hall's warmth and the inexorable call of the stone door. He walked again to that threshold, the carved spiral etched into the granite seeming to pulse faintly beneath his fingertips, a heartbeat, echoing the slow drum of his own. The village had begun to speak again. Quietly at first, voices woven with the weight of memory. Stories spilled from cracked lips, of vanished kin, of nights filled with whispered fears, of the spirals that seemed to writhe beneath the walls like living things, but also of dreams. Strange, fragmented songs sung by those who dared to remember. Tova approached him one evening, the flicker of a candlelight in her eyes. "We cannot forget," she said softly, "but we must not be prisoners to the past." Her words settled over him like a balm. The song they had sung was not the end, but a beginning, a fragile truce with the darkness that had claimed so much. Yet Leif knew that the spiral's hold was not so easily broken. It was a living thing, patient and slow, weaving itself into the marrow of their bones. That night, the wind whispered through the village, carrying with it a scent both sweet and bitter. Leif stood watch beneath the stars, the axe heavy in his hands, but his heart heavier still. Somewhere beneath the earth, the song pulsed, waiting, always waiting. He closed his eyes and sang softly, the melody threading through the cold night air. It was a song of sorrow and strength, of endings and beginnings, a song that held the weight of history and the fragile hope of tomorrow. And as the village slept beneath a blanket of frost and shadow, the spirals glowed once more, faint, steady, and waiting. The village lingered in the fragile dawn, a place caught between the past and the promise of a future yet unseen. The frost melted slowly under the reluctant touch of the sun, each droplet a whispered prayer against the shadow that still clung to every corner. Life had returned to the streets, but not fully. It moved in half shapes and half whispers, as if the village itself were still waking from a long and troubled sleep. Leif's footsteps echoed softly on the worn stones as he made his way toward the mead hall. The faces that met his were pale but alive, eyes brightened by hope, yet dimmed by memories that refused to fade. The spirals, those silent witnesses, seemed to watch from doorframes and beams, their carved edges softened by time and rain, yet still throbbing with a quiet power. Inside the hall, Tova tended a small fire, its flame flickering weakly against the chill that seeped through the wooden walls. She looked up as Leif entered, the lines on her face deepening with the weight of all they had endured. "We've come far," she said quietly, "but the spiral's thread is not broken. Not yet." Leif nodded, the truth of her words settling deep within his chest. The song had been sung, the memories stirred awake, but the spiral was a web woven tight with loss and fear, and it would not unravel without sacrifice. That night, beneath a sky bruised with gathering clouds, Leif found himself drawn once more to the stone door. The village was asleep, its breath slow and shallow, but beneath the earth the pulse grew stronger. The carved spiral glowed faintly in the moonlight, a heartbeat measured and unyielding. Leif placed his hand on the stone, feeling the slow rhythm coursing through him like a living thing. The faces from the chamber returned in his mind, half-formed and haunting, each one a fragment of the song they had sung. Astrid, her eyes leaking black tears, Inga pale and still, the villagers lost to silence and shadow. The door was not just a threshold, but a mirror, reflecting the pain and memory bound to this land. Leif closed his eyes and began to sing once more, the melody rising from deep within, shaped by grief and a fragile hope. His voice carried through the cold night air, weaving through the village and into the waiting earth. The song was no longer just his, it belonged to them all, a thread connecting past and future, shadow and light. As the song reached its crescendo, the earth beneath him trembled, a deep, resonant shudder like the heartbeat of the world itself. The spirals glowed brighter, casting long shadows that twisted and danced across the snow-dusted ground. From the darkness beyond the village, figures began to emerge. Ghostly outlines at first, then clearer shapes of those lost to the spiral's grasp. They moved silently, drawn to the song, their faces etched with sorrow and recognition. Leif did not falter. He sang with all the strength left in his weary body, his voice a beacon in the night. The villagers stirred, awakening to the sound, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. One by one, the lost returned, not in flesh and blood, but as whispers in the wind, echoes in the trees, flickers of light in the fading darkness. The spiral's hold began to loosen, unraveling like smoke on the breeze. Leif felt the weight in his chest ease, the sorrow lightening as the village breathed again, slowly, cautiously, like a soul returned from the brink. When the song faded, silence fell, not empty, but full of memory, full of life, and the promise of dawn. The stone door stood quiet now, its glow dimmed but steady, a sentinel guarding the fragile boundary between worlds. Leif turned to face the village, the first true light of morning warming the horizon. He saw faces alive with hope, eyes no longer shadowed by fear. The spiral had claimed their grief, but it had also given back their song. And in that moment, beneath the awakening sky, Leif knew the village would endure, not because it had escaped the darkness, but because it had learned to sing through it. The door remained open, the spiral waited, and the song would carry on.